Hello and welcome back to the channel. We're going to be watching the extended edition of The Fellowship of the Ring. Robert has never seen it, any Lord of the Rings, and I haven't really seen the extended editions, but I've seen clips here and there on YouTube, so I kind of do know what's missing. But anyway, what kind of knowledge do you have about Tolkien and Lord of the Rings?
None, really. I mean, very, very sketchy. I mean,
Okay.
I know a little bit about his biography. I know he was in Oxford, down the road from where we are. I used to walk past his house a lot when I was at postgrad in Oxford, around the corner. He was at Exeter College. I was at All Souls, so I used to walk past there. So I know bits about his background. I know a little bit about Owen Barfield and C.S. Lewis. Used to go drinking in the pub, the Eagle and Child, which is currently being renovated. But I've never read Lord of the Rings and I'm not familiar with the films.
Okay. We're just going to watch the opening scene, which is the kind of dialogue that Galadriel has, which you don't know who that is. But anyway, okay, it's the opening scene which kind of sets the story up and gives a bit of history and background.
Okay.
The world is changed. I feel it in the water. I feel it in the earth. I smell it in the air. Much that once was is lost, for none now live who remember it. It began with the forging of the great rings. 3 were given to the elves, immortal, wisest and fairest of all beings. 7 to the dwarf lords, great miners and craftsmen of the mountain halls. And 9 rings were gifted to the race of men, who above all else desire power. For within these rings was bound the strength and will to govern each race. But they were all of them deceived, for another ring was made. In the land of Mordor, in the fires of Mount Doom, the Dark Lord Sauron forged in secret a master ring to control all others. And into this ring he poured his cruelty, his malice, and his will to dominate all life. One ring to rule them all. One by one, the free lands of Middle-earth fell to the power of the ring. But there were some who resisted. A last alliance of men and elves marched against the armies of Mordor, and on the slopes of Mount Doom, they fought for the freedom of Middle-earth. But the power of the ring could not be undone. It was in this moment, when all hope had faded, that Isildur, son of the king, took up his father's sword. Sauron, the enemy of the free peoples of Middle-earth, was defeated. The ring passed to Isildur, who had this one chance to destroy evil forever. But the hearts of men are easily corrupted, and the Ring of Power has a will of its own. It betrayed Isildur to his death. And some things that should not have been forgotten were lost. History became legend. Legend became myth. And for 2,500 years, the ring passed out of all knowledge. Until, when chance came, it ensnared a new bearer. The ring came to the creature Gollum, who took it deep into the tunnels of the Misty Mountains. And there, it consumed him. The ring brought to Gollum unnatural long life. For 500 years it poisoned his mind. And in the gloom of Gollum's cave, it waited. Darkness crept back into the forests of the world. Rumor grew of a shadow in the east, whispers of a nameless fear. And the Ring of Power perceived. Its time had now come. It abandoned Gollum. But something happened then the ring did not intend. It was picked up by the most unlikely creature imaginable.
What's this?
A hobbit. Bilbo Baggins of the Shire.
A ring.
For the time will soon come when hobbits will shape the fortunes of all.
Do you have any first thoughts?
There's a lot going on in that.
Yeah.
And it's a fairly long clip. I don't know how long we watched, but...
Yeah, from what there was a bit that has been added because I know the theatrical cut so well, but it's not a lot though.
Well, as I say, there's a lot going on. So we have, in the first phase, before there's really anything on screen, we have a black screen after the movie production credits and the PG certificate. We have a black screen, don't we? And then we have the voiceover.
Mm.
The voiceover, I understand, is that of Kate Blanchett.
Yeah.
That's already interesting because it's mainly a male story and a story about men.
Mm.
So we have a female voiceover. I assume that was an editorial choice to offset a little bit the kind of...
Yeah, actually, I did read that Gandalf, Ian McKellen's character, was going to do that, and then they changed it to Kate Blanchett. Yeah.
And I assume that was to add a bit of not balance for the sake of it, but add just a different kind of quality of voice to everything else. And so we're on the hands of the narrator at the beginning. And in literary criticism, one often makes this distinction between the reliable and unreliable narrator. So Nabokov would be the kind of master of the unreliable narrator because you're thinking the narrator's strange even as he's telling you a story. But here, I mean, Kate Blanchett is almost the epitome of the reliable narrator,
that's true.
authoritative informed,
very comforting,
didactic, and with a knowledge which is kind of encyclopedic, and she serves as a kind of guide to the viewer throughout that clip. And so I was surprised to then, I assume that was Cate Blanchett in a brief scene as one of the 3 or 4 people.
3 elves,
The 3 elves gathered, because that seemed to me an unusual editorial choice, that she would go from being the detached, disembodied voice of the reliable narrator, occupying a meta position that we, the viewer, implicitly trust, to then being a character in the drama. So as if she's come down onto the stage and participated with other people. So I was a little bit surprised about that. I wasn't sure then whether there might be an element of bias in what she was describing. And of course there is bias, because she describes, Sauron in negative terms. Obviously there's a kind of good versus evil thing, and we, the viewer, are being encouraged towards a view of the world which is anti-Sauron, pro-Hobbit, and so on. Right. So it's neutral, but it's kind of not neutral at the same time. So we have kind of some layers of framing of apparent neutrality that are in fact a little bit tinged. And after all, it's well known, whoever tells the story owns the power.
It's true.
As in the phrase, it's the victor who tells the story of history.
So victors write history.
Exactly. So there's a little bit about that. Would have been interesting to have them narrated by Sauron or something.
That would have been interesting.
Right. We could have a kind of mirror image or inverse version of the Ring story. A little bit like, I was saying it's highly allusive, this scene, and one of the many, many, many allusions in this film is to Milton's Paradise Lost, I think. And of course, one of the interesting things about Paradise Lost in Milton is that you do get a sympathetic Satan. And one of the kind of classic exam questions that comes up for students studying Paradise Lost in Milton is whether the Satan is a bit too sympathetic, because you're getting a view inside his mind, and in any case he's a fallen angel.
The devil was an angel once, that kind of thing.
We're not quite getting the same level of, at least in this clip, and maybe it occurs later on, we're not quite getting the same level of ambivalence here.
I'm not there's a lot in Tolkien that I don't know, but I feel like I have a vague idea that maybe Sauron was an elf, or
right,
this, or maybe like in the lore or something, like there's something to do with him being maybe he had something to do with the elves, and the elves being like the divine characters in the story. I don't know. I'm sure people will tell us. But actually, if you do know that, let us know, because that is interesting.
It would be interesting, because that would be a sort of Miltonic echo, that somebody who was once good has fallen and become vengeful, spiteful, full of resentment as a result. Because after all, one needs a sort of account of why Sauron has ended up like that. Otherwise it's kind of, almost out of the blue, or is this a figure of intrinsic evil? Because there's then a theory of evil around that. Is evil something that develops in reaction to events? Or is it something that is, intrinsic and not determined by circumstance? So there's a whole set of questions, obviously, around that. So there's that going on. And of course, in relation to the good-evil theme, which we're encouraged to take on a little bit, again, one of the many, 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 many references in that opening is to the book of Genesis, and the origin of creation, really, because we have a black screen which evokes the kind of nothingness before light. Before light, exactly, before the acts of intention and creation that in Genesis are attributed to God, the making of light. And it's interesting, actually, even when the film does allow light in, it's pretty subdued, and the kind of colouring is quite sombre. And most of the light actually in that clip is reflected light off rings, off armor, and so on. So there's very little kind of sunlight, and most of it is firelight, as far as I can work out.
Yeah, it's quite metal based.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we have elements of the earth, metal, and fire, don't we? Which we associate, exactly, with, as it were, kind of primary materials, and that's what we're being encouraged to understand, that this is a discourse on primary, a priori creations and setups of things. So we're in the kind of dark origin of spaces. So all of that is going on in a kind of evocation of the moment of Genesis, kind of deep origins, if you like. And the music, I think it's worth saying, supports that. I mean, I heard three kinds of music through that. There is the semi-medieval polyphony at the beginning, the a cappella voices.
Oh yeah.
Which suggest obviously something sacred. Something also, I think, in the Christian tradition, I think it's worth noting. And again, a preoccupation with divinity, with the supernatural, with something greater than the human. And I think all of that is evoked in the sort of plain song or polyphony at the beginning. But then we switch into the more Wagnerian orchestral music, strings, something a little bit on the cusp between the kind of the martial and the romantic. Romantic in the sense of here's a quest, epic perhaps is a better word than romantic. I mean romantic not in the sense of love stories, as in a romance, medieval romance, but quite foreboding. So we have we go from the plain song, which suggests something theological or sacred, perhaps is a better word, into the kind of post-Wagnerian orchestration, which suggests to me something much more epic. We're dealing with an epic here. This is clearly not music that you'd use for a sitcom jingle or something like that. It suggests something of scale, impact, of generations, and of empires. All of those things evoked. And because of that slightly Wagnerian tone in it, again, we're getting a sense of kind of legendary characters. Kate Blanchett makes this point about moving from history to legend to myth.
Legend to myth, yeah. I really like that line.
Do you?
Yeah. I remember always thinking, like, what's the difference between legend and myth?
Yeah.
Like when I was younger.
Well, I mean, I think that's a valid question.
Yeah.
And I think it's debatable what the difference between legend and myth is. I mean, just as a sidebar, since we're talking about it, legend and myth, I mean, the word myth is a Greek word mythos. Legend, although it comes via Latin, also goes back to a Greek word logos, and the words for law as well as kind of related back to logos. So legend is also about, a legend is, although it's mythological, is also laying down a law about the past and the kind of precepts or inherited precepts about what might be obeyed. So there are clues in a legend as to how a current society might conduct itself. A myth, on the other hand, might be something which is more insubstantial or a matter of imagination. But it's something we could sort of continue to discuss. And this clean separation which the narrator makes between history, legend, and myth, I mean, any historian would tell you, it's very hard to separate those things out sometimes, especially the further you go back into the annals of time.
Yeah.
So, I mean, maybe that's something we can come back to.
Yeah, it's almost like something like King Arthur or Robin Hood.
Exactly.
We don't know anymore. Is it? How old is this legend? It's kind of accepted it's not history, that it's legend. Now it's more of like, well, how old is this legend? When did it start? So, it's just.
Yeah. I mean, there's one definition of legend which is, it's history without an author.
Yeah.
But I use this word annals of history a little bit punningly, because the word annals is related to the word annulus and the ring. There's an interesting text by French philosopher Jacques Derrida on the concept of rings, the annulus, and the relation between the annulus in Latin and the notion of the year, l'an in French, because a year is that which returns and goes around a circular motion, and a ring is obviously circular at the same time. And that notion of things coming around again, I think, is also, apart from the many other associations with the notion of the ring, is at play there. If you wait long enough, it comes round. It might take 500 years before the ring is rediscovered, but it will. So we have a concept of history there, which is more, which is linear, but curvilinear rather than rectilinear. History goes in these cycles rather than a straight line or a kind of movement upwards towards a new shape, or perhaps both. But there is a circular, annular concept of history and or myth and or legend, which I think is involved in that scene as well. Things come around, and something which is lost can be refound, and so on. And I want to come back to the concept of the ring, but just on the sacred, the kind of mythic, sacred, mysterious, mystical elements there. I think it's very important, and perhaps characteristic of Tolkien, I don't know, that despite all of that, we end up with a hobbit in a shire. So we transition from an epic register, which is grand and obscure, inscrutable, and perhaps a little bit scary and quite other, metaphysical in some ways, into something very familiar. So a shire couldn't be more familiar. It's very English, it's very grounded, and there's something semi-comic in the figure of the hobbit as well. So we are transitioning quite interestingly from the one to the other. I wouldn't describe it as tragicomedy, because I don't think, there are elements of tragedy in that opening. I think epic is a better word than tragedy for it. And it's not quite comedy when we get to the hobbit.
What, you mean when he finds the ring?
Or just the figure even of the hobbit. It's familiar, it's not threatening, it's capable of a certain level of humour. I would describe that as a transition not from the tragic to the comic so much as from the epic to what's known as I don't know if you're familiar with the word, the picaresque. It's the idea of kind of human journeys on a less epic scale in very vaguely familiar surroundings that involve kind of human interactions. A bit like, Don Quixote would be an example of the picaresque. In a way, the Canterbury Tales would be an example of the picaresque. And you do, and of course, one of the few things I do know about Tolkien was that he was a professor of medieval literature, among other things, phonology. And of course, there is that sense of, Middle England. We also have a sense of Middle English, which is the transitional language out of a kind of lower English via French and so on into modern day English, which was the language really that Chaucer and so on, and Gower under the court of Richard II really were kind of beginning to move out of. So there's that element of kind of medievalism coming through too, which in the English literary tradition makes this move to the human scale, kind of out of the church, as it were, into the countryside, which is sort of the movement you see there, not from the church as such, but from the sacred space, certainly from the mythological.
It's like an authority, kind of like all-being authority space.
Exactly, yeah. So it feels like you're moving from certainly the mythological space into something a bit more familiar. And the word shire, of course, kind of encapsulates that.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about the numbers in the opening. So there was 3 rings for elves, 7 for the dwarves, and 9 for men.
Yeah.
That's funny, 7 dwarves.
Yeah, exactly. I couldn't help
I hadn't thought of that. Is there any kind of symbolism in those numbers?
There's a whole
They're all odd numbers, yeah.
They're all odd numbers, and there's a enormous tradition of numerology which ascribes meaning, more or less cryptic meaning to numbers. And I think rather than getting caught up on, 3 means that is it a reference to the Trinity, is 7 a reference to the 7 deadly sins and so on. I mean, all of these are legitimate lines of inquiry, but I think it's more the fact that numerology per se is suggestive of meaning and a kind of sort of cryptological approach to that film, which suggests that, were we able to decode these things, we would have access to something, suggestive of a higher truth, as though there is an unlocking. And there is a kind of, if I'm right, there was a little bit of a metaphor of the unlocking going on in that, the accessing of truths. Although the ring is a ring, it's also kind of a key.
Yeah, it's a master ring.
And then we go on to the idea of the master ring or the passepartout, which is the key, the key that opens all the locks.
Yeah.
So it's interesting that, the ring is also a key. I mean, it's a key in several senses because it's also a key to the movie. It's like the legend in the other sense, legend of a map. It's a way of decoding for us, the viewer, what's happening in the film. And it's one of my reflections on the whole sequence of that opening is that it's a little bit like a board game where you're entering a new world with new rules and you're being told what are the pieces, what are the cards, what are the values, what are the point systems in this world. So there's something about rings, there's something about goodies and baddies, there's something about hobbits. Here is the kind of collected apparatus that you, the viewer or player of this board game, will need to avail yourself of in order to become part of it. So I think there's a board game setup quality to that opening sequence. And what makes it particularly like that is that you're being invited into a world. Here is a world, and again, my very partial understanding of Tolkien is that that's kind of what he's doing. And he's very much in an English tradition there. I mentioned Milton, who sort of establishes a world based on Genesis. William Blake, I think, would be another strong person in this tradition that Tolkien then picks up on. Here is a world which I'm creating. And what makes a world have characteristics as a unified space is that it has a set of codes and rules to learn, which make sense in themselves. And that would correspond with so there's a philosopher you may have heard of called Ludwig Wittgenstein, who has this concept of the language game. And I'm extrapolating, and this isn't exactly what Wittgenstein says, this is more me sort of riffing on Wittgenstein, but basically what applies here is that anything can make sense as long as that within that world, things make sense to the people within it. So you can create a language which nobody else understands. So you and I could start speaking a language in which none of the viewers would understand. But as long as you and I understand it, we can make meaning and communicate. So all languages in that sense are local and shared. And in a way, what we're getting in The Lord of the Rings there is like what Wittgenstein says about a language game. Well, as long as you generate things which have meaning and value within that context, then anybody who has the key, the legend of those signifiers, can then participate in that game. So it does have the quality for me of A, a board game, and B, more philosophically, the language game. We can create worlds which we then enter, and it reminded me a little bit, again, something I know zero about, but things like Dungeons and Dragons, where you're creating a world, you're world building. And what matters about the world is that the participants understand the rules and speak the same language and so on. So it has a valency within that space. Wittgenstein says, well, actually, this is applicable to all language, but I mean, that's a kind of another route to go down. But it does slightly have that quality of the, as it were, the pragmatic, the useful use of meaning. If it works, if it means something to you, then it means something to me. And now in this space, which we, the viewer, are being inculcated in, we can then play that game, because then when we see a ring or a hobbit, it's like, okay, now I know how to decode that. I know what values to ascribe to it, and I become, if not a participant in that game, at least an informed observer, and can read the value system within it.
Yeah. I think when people think of Lord of the Rings as well, it can be quite intimidating.
Yeah.
Because they're not
au fait with all of that.
Initiated into the world building.
Yes, I think initiated is a much better word, actually, because it's like that. It's as if there's not only a world there which already has its own codes and rules. It's as if the Cate Blanchett voice at the beginning is initiating us, the reader. Like, you need to know these things, dear seeker, in order to enter this space. So here are the keys, as it were, and we're being metaphorically given the clothing and the scepters, the orbs, the crowns, or whatever, in order to participate. But just back on the ring, because there's so many associations with it. There are this notion of the annular, which is to do with the returning of the year, which in turn, as I said, suggests different concepts of history as moving in circles rather than straight lines. It is clearly suggestive of infinity, which we know. But I think more from a more psychological point of view, I mean, we know rings, apart from in the monarchical tradition, where rings are handed down.
What is that?
Kings and queens, where rings are handed down as symbols of power from kings to princes and so on. We also know them principally as wedding rings, and as rings in a matrimonial setting, they symbolize loyalty and commitment and bonding. And right from the beginning of that, we are being advised, as it were, to pick a side in this, and typically we will pick the side of the hobbits and the goodies, as it were.
And Cate Blanchett.
So we are being given a choice about where to belong and where our bonds as viewers lie in that film. And we're given the sense that tribal belonging, because we then have a description of tribes towards the end, don't we, will be key in this thing. Where do loyalties lie? What's the bond or belonging group that I'm going to choose? And the ring is a continual reminder of tribal loyalties, within the film. So it has all of that. And then, of course, on top of all of that, there is the ring as power.
Yeah.
Which we can talk about. One of the most interesting things for me in that clip is the fact that the power of the ring is ambivalent. It's not.
And it has a will of its own, and it's like it's a being almost.
Yeah.
Like it chooses where it goes. Yeah.
Well, exactly. Yeah. So it has. Has a certain sense of a kind of agency, and that its effects can be benign or malign in a way that, as far as I can work out, seems a little bit to mirror the person who's holding it. So the ring is a key, but the ring is also a mirror to some degree.
Yeah.
As far as I can tell. And there's a sense that there's a kind of cautionary element within the opening there, which says, be careful what you wish for, I suppose, is the message. Like, you might want this ring, but it's stronger than you are, and you might not be able to control it. So there is a moral call on your conscience about what you seek to do with your agency in the world.
Yeah, I think there is an element of it being a mirror, and what do you do when you see yourself and you see it's that you might not want to acknowledge about yourself. Yeah. Thank you for watching, and please do subscribe to the channel, because it will give us more time to make more of these videos. So yeah, if you enjoy it, like, subscribe, comment. We really enjoyed reading all the comments on the first video that we made, so thank you.